Unfortunately, it's looking really bad for Lil Baby, and as I'm going to show you, the police have already been looking very closely into his operation, and this is just going to be the cherry on top, unfortunately, for prosecutors that have been coming for 4 p.m.
Lil Baby is now facing serious legal pressure after allegedly shooting an NFL player Keion White, a development that has shifted what first sounded like rumor into something authorities appear to be treating with real weight. He was eventually pushed to address the situation publicly in an effort to clear his name, but the timing of that response is what stands out, because indications suggest federal attention may already be moving in. Before examining what he said in his defense, it is necessary to walk through the full sequence of events carefully, because the details surrounding this incident reveal a chain reaction that did not begin where most people think it did. The situation is volatile, layered, and potentially and observers close to the case have quietly suggested that moments like this often become turning points rather than temporary scandals. There is a reason this story has drawn attention beyond entertainment headlines. Beneath the surface is a convergence of environments that rarely collide in such a concentrated way. Professional sports, nightlife, money culture, private access circles, and the kind of behind-the-scenes tension that usually stays hidden. Accounts indicate that what happened that night was not random chaos, but a sequence of interactions building toward a flashpoint. Those who have followed similar cases recognize the pattern. When multiple high-profile worlds intersect in one place, the outcome is rarely simple, and the public version of events often leaves out the elements that matter most. Those paying close attention, including viewers who follow Cloud Chase for deeper breakdowns, already understand that stories like this tend to unfold in layers rather than headlines. To understand why this incident carries weight, it helps to understand who Keion White is. He is not an unknown figure or a background name pulled into drama. He is a 27-year-old NFL defensive end, standing 6'4" and weighing roughly 285 pounds. A professional athlete whose career depends on discipline, performance, and physical dominance. Players at that level are paid millions because they represent elite investment assets for their teams.
That hurt 49ers defensive end Keion White. It happened early yesterday morning at a nightclub in San Francisco's Mission District. Our partners at SF Standard report White was hosting a Super Bowl party at Delia Lounge on Mission Street. At some point, White got into an argument involving rapper Lil Baby. That's when White was shot in the ankle. Nearby residents say they were woken up by police activity.
Organizations do not commit that kind of money to individuals who cannot maintain focus or stability. White had built his reputation as someone who stayed centered on his work, avoided distractions, and treated football as a long-term profession rather than a temporary spotlight. In October, the San Francisco 49ers acquired him from the New England Patriots, a move widely viewed as strategic rather than experimental. Reports at the time described his season as a breakout stretch, the kind that elevates a player from promising to essential. For someone in that position, everything matters: public image, physical health, and the absence of controversy. Careers at that level can take years to build and seconds to destabilize. The significance of this case is tied directly to that reality. One night, one confrontation, or one misunderstanding can threaten what took a lifetime of work to secure. What makes the situation more unusual is that White was not known for street-level affiliations or reckless behavior. He carried the profile of a college-educated professional focused on performance metrics, training schedules, and career longevity. People familiar with his background describe him as someone who kept distance from unnecessary conflict.
Window is like right by my bed, and so I saw lights. I think that's why I woke up at first. I think I kind of knew that it wasn't like the most safe place, but honestly, it kind of seems par for the course. I'm not entirely how could this happen here?
That context is critical because when someone with that reputation becomes connected to an incident like this, it signals that the circumstances surrounding it were not ordinary. It suggests an environment intense enough to pull even cautious individuals into its orbit. The timeline begins on February 9th, 2025. Immediately after the Super Bowl, when San Francisco was still moving with the aftershock energy of hosting the largest sporting event in the country, the city was filled with celebrations, private gatherings, and exclusive parties. White chose to host one of those gatherings himself, organizing a private Super Bowl event at Dia Lounge on Mission Street. On the surface, it looked like a standard post-event celebration. In reality, it was structured as a controlled guest environment. A closed door, function designed for a select crowd rather than the general public. Witness descriptions and the police paint a scene that resembled something staged rather than spontaneous. Officers who entered the venue later documented numerous scantily clad women collecting dollar bills. Scattered across the floor, several of the entertainers were topless, clearly working as adult performers within the private event setting. The report's language was clinical, but the imagery was vivid enough to suggest a high-energy atmosphere fueled by money, status, and exclusivity. It was not simply a party.
Tonight at 11, police are working to try to find out who opened fire on the set of a music video reportedly featuring Atlanta's very own Lil Baby.
The shooting happened just before 5 o'clock tonight. There is a map right here on your screen of where this all took place on Verbena Street. That's in the Dixie Hills neighborhood in the northwest part of the city.
3 men were shot just feet behind me in this parking lot. One shot in the neck, another man shot in the back, the third victim shot in the...
It was an environment built around spectacle, access. In hierarchy, the timeline then intersects with Lil Baby. He had performed in San Francisco the night before as part of his tour. Finishing a show that already placed him in the city's nightlife circuit, instead of returning to his hotel after the performance, he chose to continue the evening. Moving through the same post-Super Bowl party landscape that many celebrities were navigating that night, that decision becomes important because it set the stage for where paths crossed. By the time he arrived at Dia Lounge, White's private gathering was already underway downstairs. While Lil Baby's entourage remained on the main floor above, according to the police account, Lil Baby and his group wanted access to the exclusive, lower-level party hosted by White. The problem was that they had not been invited. That detail, small on its own, becomes critical when viewed in sequence. Because restricted access events operate on strict control. Entry is not casual, and attempts to bypass that structure can escalate tension quickly. What followed next would depend entirely on how that request was handled, who intervened, and what was said in those moments when access, status, and pride collided in a confined space.
Those suspects, as far as the 3 victims, they are expected to survive. As of this hour, Lil Baby's team has not commented on the shooting.
Anyone who has watched these kinds of environments, collide understands how quickly tension can arise when status is involved. When rappers attempt to enter spaces controlled by high-profile athletes, especially private events built on exclusivity, pride becomes part of the equation. In this case, the setting amplified everything. Keion White, a 6'4", 285-pound NFL defensive end, accustomed to physical dominance on the field, was surrounded by people close to him celebrating a milestone weekend tied to the Super Bowl. It was his event, his guest list, his controlled space. At the same time, Lil Baby arrived with his own reputation and expectations. As a chart-topping artist used to VIP access in nearly every venue he enters, walking into a club but being denied entry into a private section downstairs likely shifted the energy immediately. Witness accounts suggest the exchange escalated quickly. Police later recorded statements from individuals who described the confrontation as tense and confrontational almost from the beginning. One witness stated that Lil Baby's crew appeared aggressive, pressing for access into the restricted area. Another witness described White as unyielding, refusing to give ground in his own space. From both perspectives, the standoff carried weight. On one side was a rapper accustomed to doors opening automatically. On the other was an NFL player hosting a private event tied to his own success. Neither man is known for appearing weak in public settings. Neither would likely accept being dismissed. That combination is often enough to push verbal disputes into dangerous territory, particularly when entourages are involved. Groups amplify ego. Groups amplify reaction. And once multiple individuals start engaging, the temperature rises fast, according to one witness. The argument intensified to the point where he left the immediate area to retrieve the club manager in an effort to calm things down. That decision, intended to de-escalate, instead marked the final calm moment, before everything shifted. While he was upstairs seeking help, he reported hearing 2 gunshots from below. The sound cut through the club atmosphere instantly. Music, shouting, and celebration gave way to something far more serious. When the witness returned downstairs, the scene had transformed. Keion White was on the ground with a gunshot wound to his left ankle. Blood was visible. Panic had replaced celebration. Guests were screaming, pushing toward exits, trying to understand what had just happened. In seconds, a private Super Bowl party had turned into an active crime scene. That shift is important. Incidents like this are rarely gradual. They are explosive. Complicating matters further, another witness reported hearing 4 gunshots rather than 2. That discrepancy would become significant once police arrived. At approximately 4:06 a.m., officers responded to reports of shots fired and began securing the location. On the floor, they located 2 separate shell casings, one from a 9mm firearm and another from a .45 caliber weapon. That detail alone suggested either multiple weapons were involved or more than one person discharged a firearm. Either possibility raises the seriousness of the event. It eliminates the idea of a single stray shot or an isolated accident. Investigators also recovered an abandoned cell phone at the scene. In cases like this, a phone is rarely just a misplaced object. It can contain location data, call logs, text exchanges, digital fingerprints that reconstruct timelines down to the minute. Federal investigators are known for building cases around digital trails, especially when high-profile individuals are involved. The presence of that device immediately expands the scope of what authorities can examine. Forensic analysis can determine who handled it, who it contacted, and whether it connects to anyone present that night. The police report itself described an environment that still carried traces of the party, even after gunfire disrupted it. Officers documented topless adult entertainers, continuing to gather dollar bills scattered across the floor while other guests attempted to leave. Blood marked the area where White had fallen. The contrast was stark. Money, spectacle, and celebration existed in the same physical space as violence and injury. For responding officers walking into that scene shortly after 4 a.m., the setting would have appeared chaotic and surreal. What began as a private celebration had, within minutes, become evidence preserved under flashing lights. What stood out to investigators? Almost immediately was Keion White's response once officers began asking questions. When police asked him who shot him, he gave them nothing. The report states clearly that when asked who had shot him, White was uncooperative. He did not identify anyone. He did not offer a name. He did not assist in pointing the investigation in any direction. For someone with millions on the line and a career tied to corporate sponsorships and league discipline, that kind of silence carries weight. It suggests a decision made in the moment, one that aligned less with public image and more with a code often. Associated with environments far removed from NFL locker rooms, that silence also complicates everything that followed. Because when the victim refuses to cooperate, law enforcement does not stop. They widen the lens. They start looking at patterns, affiliations, prior incidents, and in Lil Baby's case, that background was already under scrutiny long before this night at Dial Lounge. This is not the first time his name has appeared in investigative conversations. Federal authorities have reportedly been monitoring his circle for years. Surveillance, association mapping, financial tracing, social media review. These processes do not happen overnight. They are built slowly, methodically. When the Atlanta District Attorney Fani Willis publicly announced that she was pursuing broader racketeering cases involving local rap crews, Lil Baby's name surfaced in connection to that larger focus on organized activity tied to 4PF. When prosecutors assemble task forces, they do so with long-term strategy in mind. They build files. They collect digital evidence. They document movements and connections. Federal investigations rarely begin with one event. They accumulate incidents. They establish behavioral patterns. They examine whether public actions reflect private structure. By the time something like a nightclub shooting enters the picture, it does not exist in isolation. It becomes another data point layered onto an existing framework. That is why this situation carries more risk than a single confrontation would suggest. There was already an earlier incident that significantly intensified federal attention. It involved a music video shoot in Atlanta, conducted directly inside a neighborhood widely understood to be hostile territory for Lil Baby's camp. This was not neutral ground. It was a block where tensions had already escalated in the past. Instead of avoiding the area, production crews were brought in. Cameras were set up. Footage was recorded openly. The visuals from that shoot showed Lil Baby and members of his circle displaying money, signaling affiliation and asserting presence in a space associated with rivals. In street environments, symbolism matters. Territorial lines are not theoretical. They carry history. When a group enters a rival's neighborhood and broadcasts it publicly, the message extends beyond entertainment. It communicates dominance. It invites reaction. According to law enforcement summaries tied to that incident, the video circulated widely online. And shortly after its release, retaliation followed. Armed individuals reportedly drove through an area associated with Lil Baby's side of the conflict. Shots were fired, but the intended targets were not the ones hit. 2 teenagers, ages 16 and 17, were killed in the crossfire. They were not involved in any rap feud. They were not participants in online exchanges. They were minors who became casualties in a chain reaction sparked by territorial provocation. The aftermath shifted the tone of federal interest. Investigators began examining whether public displays connected to organized groups could reasonably foresee violent retaliation. The argument was not simply about lyrics or imagery. It was about causation. If a high-profile figure enters rival territory, films a video taunting opponents, and violence follows. Prosecutors begin asking whether that sequence establishes responsibility beyond coincidence. Families of the victims demanded accountability. Community leaders voiced outrage. The focus moved from entertainment culture to systemic influence. Federal authorities reportedly began building a theory that certain actions, even if framed as artistic expression, could function as triggers within ongoing rivalries. That theory does not require the artist to pull a trigger personally. It examines whether the conduct contributes directly to predictable escalation. When placed alongside the nightclub shooting involving Keion White, this earlier case becomes relevant context. Investigators do not separate incidents neatly when examining potential organized patterns. They connect them. They look for repetition. They evaluate whether environments tied to one individual consistently produce violence around them. That is the lens through which this current situation may now be viewed. As federal attention intensified, authorities began framing the broader pattern under a RICO lens. Their position was not that Lil Baby was simply an artist who occasionally referenced street culture and music. They argued that he functioned as the head of a coordinated criminal structure operating under the banner of his brand. In that framing, the music video filmed in rival territory was not artistic expression. It was characterized as organized gang activity that directly triggered retaliatory violence. And when prosecutors adopt that theory, the threshold shifts from individual actions to enterprise responsibility. Under a RICO approach, the focus expands outward. Investigators begin mapping the entire circle. Associates, financial backers, affiliates, promoters. They examine prior arrests, probation records, digital footprints. Social media posts become exhibits. Financial transfers become timelines. Communication patterns become networks. Reports indicate that law enforcement deployed the full federal playbook: wiretaps, surveillance footage, confidential informants. These are not casual tools. They are reserved for cases authorities believe involve structured, ongoing activity. And RICO statutes carry severe penalties. If prosecutors can establish a criminal enterprise and demonstrate that specific acts furthered its operation, sentences can range from decades to life. Music itself also entered the evidentiary discussion. Lyrics referencing violence, drug trafficking, or street affiliations were scrutinized not as metaphor, but as potential admissions. Each line became subject to interpretation. Each visual element in music videos was treated as contextual support. For years, artists have argued that creative expression should not be conflated with confession. But in federal courtrooms, prosecutors often attempt to bridge that gap when building enterprise cases. In this situation, songs that once elevated brand identity were reportedly analyzed as pieces of a larger puzzle. Facing that kind of heat, Lil Baby began making strategic adjustments. One of the first moves was the dissolution of 4PF, the label whose name stood for Four Pockets Full. Authorities had started describing it less as a music imprint and more as a structured organization tied to coordinated activity. Closing that chapter signaled awareness of the optics. It was not simply a business pivot. It was a legal repositioning. He then launched a new label called Glass Window. The name itself appeared intentional. Glass implies visibility. Window suggests openness. The rebrand projected transparency, an attempt to communicate that there was nothing concealed behind the operation. It carried the symbolism of clean structure and legitimate business. Public messaging shifted accordingly. Images featuring weapons or coded street symbolism were replaced with posts highlighting business ventures, philanthropy, family life, and corporate partnerships. The narrative moved from survival in hostile environments to expansion in boardrooms. He also began restructuring his inner circle. Individuals perceived as liabilities were removed. In street terminology, those known for impulsive or reckless behavior, often described as crash dummies, were distanced from decision-making roles. In their place came accountants, attorneys, compliance advisors, and licensed managers. The goal appeared clear: surround the brand with professionalism rather than volatility. Investments expanded into real estate holdings, restaurants, and ventures positioned as legitimate revenue streams. Each move suggested an effort to demonstrate lawful income and stability, but structural changes do not automatically dissolve existing investigations. Once federal agencies begin building a case, rebranding alone does not erase collected data. Surveillance records remain. Informant testimony remains. Digital archives remain. If prosecutors believe they have established a timeline of enterprise activity, new labels and revised imagery are evaluated in light of what already exists. That is where the San Francisco shooting becomes particularly significant. In isolation, it could be framed as a nightclub dispute that escalated unexpectedly. But within a broader investigative narrative, it risks being interpreted as continuation rather than anomaly. When federal authorities assess patterns, they ask whether environments linked to a central figure consistently generate conflict. They evaluate whether escalation follows presence. And if they determine that prior adjustments were reactive rather than transformative, the event at Dia Lounge may be treated not as coincidence, but as confirmation. This is why observers close to federal procedures suggest the nightclub incident could alter the Dia trajectory entirely. Not because of one confrontation alone, but because of how it fits into an existing investigative structure. When prosecutors believe they are assembling an enterprise case, each additional incident strengthens their leverage. In RICO prosecutions, leverage often determines outcome. When the alleged victim is an NFL player, the scale of the investigation changes immediately. This is no longer a matter confined to local patrol officers and routine reports. Multiple agencies begin coordinating. Jurisdiction expands. Resources increase. The National Football League is not just a sports association. It is a multi-billion-dollar corporate entity that treats its players as high-value investments. When one of those assets is shot, the response is not passive. The league maintains its own security infrastructure and investigative channels. They communicate directly with law enforcement. They monitor developments closely. Their interest is not symbolic. It is financial and repo. The San Francisco 49ers organization has its own stake as well. They had recently traded assets to acquire Keion White, believing he was entering a breakout phase. Teams do not move strategically unless they project long-term value. If that value is compromised by gun violence at a nightclub, internal pressure builds quickly. Ownership groups demand clarity. Legal departments assess exposure. Public relations teams manage fallout. A franchise that invested heavily in a player will not ignore an event that threatens that investment. City leadership also stepped into the narrative. San Francisco Mayor Daniel Lurie issued a public statement describing any violent incident in the city as unacceptable and expressing hope for White's recovery. Reports indicate he communicated directly with both the San Francisco Police Department and 49ers leadership. When municipal leadership engages at that level, it signals that the matter has escalated beyond routine enforcement. Political accountability enters the equation. Public perception becomes part of the response. What elevates this further is jurisdictional complexity. Lil Baby is based in Atlanta. The shooting occurred in California. The alleged victim is an NFL player employed by a national organization that operates across state lines. That combination invites federal oversight. When incidents intersect, interstate travel, commerce, and structured organizations, federal statutes often become relevant. Agencies such as the FBI are empowered to evaluate whether broader patterns exist. For investigators already examining possible racketeering structures tied to Lil Baby's circle, this event may be assessed not as isolated conflict but as potential extension of ongoing behavior. Prosecutors could argue that the shooting reflects continued violent activity linked to a multi-state enterprise. In RICO theory, they may attempt to frame such acts as serving the interests of a criminal organization, protecting reputation, reinforcing dominance, or maintaining perceived credibility. Whether that argument ultimately holds in court is separate from the fact that it can be presented. From a legal standpoint, exposure exists on two fronts. Criminal charges could include attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, and weapons violations. In California, attempted murder carries penalties that can extend from 15 years to life, depending on enhancements and findings. When conspiracy and firearm allegations are added, sentencing ranges expand significantly. If prosecutors were to connect the incident to an enterprise theory under RICO, penalties could escalate further. The civil dimension may be equally consequential. Keion White could pursue damages tied to lost earnings, medical costs, pain and suffering, and long-term career impact. NFL contracts are structured around performance and availability. If injury limits or ends his playing career, projected earnings could reach into the millions. Civil litigation allows recovery not only for immediate loss, but for future potential income. The 49ers organization could also evaluate its options. If they believe a valuable asset was compromised through criminal conduct, legal teams may explore claims connected to financial loss. Franchise investments are calculated precisely. If a player acquired for competitive advantage is sidelined indefinitely, ownership may seek accountability through the courts. In high-value professional sports, contractual damages can climb rapidly. What began as a confrontation inside a nightclub now sits at the intersection of federal law, corporate interest, municipal leadership, and potential multi-million-dollar litigation. That convergence is what makes this moment particularly critical in cases involving celebrity, enterprise allegations, and high-profile victims. Outcomes are shaped not only by facts on the ground, but by the scale of institutions that respond. Lil Baby has now entered what can only be described as full damage control territory. The pressure forced him to address the situation publicly because the stakes extend far beyond one incident. His career, his business ventures, and his freedom are all tied to how this unfolds. But the reality is unforgiving. Anything he says publicly can be dissected later in court. Every word becomes a potential exhibit. If he denies involvement and surveillance footage contradicts him, prosecutors can argue deception. If he acknowledges being present and frames the incident as self-defense, that still places him at the center of a shooting involving an NFL player. Silence, on the other hand, fuels public speculation. In high-profile cases, the absence of explanation often becomes its own narrative. This creates a strategic conflict inside his camp. Legal counsel typically advises minimal public commentary. Defense attorneys prefer arguments made inside courtrooms, not on social media or in interviews. Public relations teams, however, operate under different priorities. They focus on perception, brand survival, and maintaining industry relationships. One side urges restraint, the other urges visibility. Those two objectives rarely align. And when reputational damage unfolds in real time, the tension between legal strategy and public image becomes difficult to manage. Industry reaction is another factor that cannot be ignored. Record labels are sensitive to liability and optics. Streaming platforms monitor controversy closely. Corporate sponsors assess risk constantly. When an artist's name becomes linked to allegations of shooting a professional athlete, internal conversations begin immediately. Shows can be postponed. Partnerships can be paused. Algorithms can shift visibility. None of those decisions need to be announced publicly to have impact. The music business adapts quickly when risk outweighs reward. The NFL operates on a different scale entirely. It is a corporate entity with national reach, media partnerships, and political influence. If league leadership views this incident as a direct threat to its players, it has the leverage to push aggressively for accountability. Influence does not always appear in headlines. It moves through private channels, through sponsors, broadcast partners, venue operators. The imbalance of power between a league of that magnitude and any individual artist is significant. There are precedents. Other artists who became entangled in serious criminal proceedings have watched their platforms shrink rapidly. Music pulled from playlists. Concert tours quietly canceled. Endorsement contracts dissolved. The entertainment cycle moves forward, and the industry often distances itself from perceived instability. The individual becomes an example rather than a participant. Beyond corporate dynamics, there is the regional layer. San Francisco and the broader Bay Area operate under their own cultural codes. Local pride is not abstract there. It is deeply rooted. Communities in Oakland and San Francisco carry long histories shaped by identity, independence, and territorial respect. An out-of-town figure entering that environment and becoming connected to violence does not exist in a vacuum. It resonates locally. Lil Baby's influence in Atlanta does not automatically transfer across regions. Power is contextual. Relationships are regional. In the Bay Area, he does not carry the same embedded network. When conflict touches a figure perceived as a local representative, particularly an NFL player tied to a franchise that defines part of the city's identity, the response can intensify. Athletes at that level are viewed not only as entertainers, but as civic symbols. Harm directed toward them can generate broader communal reaction. There are also broader social dynamics. The Bay Area maintains strong communal solidarity. When outsiders are perceived as bringing disruption, especially violent disruption, the emotional response extends beyond the individuals involved. That response shapes public discourse, media framing, and even juror attitudes if a case proceeds to trial. What comes next depends on evidence, charging decisions, and procedural strategy. But the convergence of federal scrutiny, corporate power, municipal engagement, and regional politics places this situation in a different category. It is no longer confined to entertainment headlines. It now sits within legal, economic, and cultural structures that operate with far greater force. From a federal perspective, the groundwork may have already been laid long before the events in San Francisco. If investigators believe they have accumulated sufficient evidence through the Atlanta probe, the nightclub shooting does not initiate a case. It strengthens one. Prosecutors could argue that Lil Baby is not merely an entertainer surrounded by controversy, but the central figure in an organization operating across state lines and engaging in violent conduct. When framed that way, the narrative aligns closely with the structure required under RICO statutes. RICO prosecutions are not casual undertakings. Federal agencies typically move only after extended investigation. Months or years of surveillance and layered documentation. The conviction rate in federal RICO cases is widely cited as extremely high. When indictments are filed, they are often supported by wiretap transcripts, financial trails, informant testimony, digital communications, and visual surveillance. By the time charges are announced, the government generally believes it has already constructed a comprehensive framework. If federal indictments were to emerge, it would likely extend beyond a single name. Enterprise cases target networks, associates, managers, affiliates, anyone. Prosecutors believe furthered the alleged organization's objectives could be named. In those scenarios, pressure tactics follow. Lower-level defendants are often offered plea agreements in exchange for testimony. Cooperation becomes currency. Statements given under oath can reshape cases rapidly. Domino effects are common once one individual decides to reduce. Exposure by providing information. 1. Plausible sequence would involve state-level proceedings in California, related to the shooting moving forward first. While those charges are addressed, a federal indictment from Atlanta could be unsealed. That timing would apply additional leverage. Prosecutors sometimes use overlapping jurisdictions to create strategic positioning. The objective is not merely conviction, but cooperation and structural dismantling. However, even cooperation under RICO does not guarantee minimal consequences. Mandatory minimums in federal cases are significant. Sentence reductions are possible, but they are not symbolic. Federal sentencing guidelines are rigid. A plea agreement might reduce exposure from life imprisonment to decades, but decades remain substantial. The difference between 15 years and life still removes an individual from the peak of his career and personal life. If a defendant proceeds to trial and loses in a RICO case, sentencing can be severe. Enterprise findings often carry enhancements tied to firearms, conspiracy, and violent acts. Life imprisonment becomes a realistic possibility when prosecutors establish leadership roles in structured criminal organizations. That is the gravity of what hangs in balance when RICO enters the conversation. The broader tragedy lies in contrast. Lil Baby built an empire through music. Chart dominance, global tours, business investments, generational wealth. He transitioned from local recognition to mainstream prominence. Opportunities expanded beyond recording endorsements, partnerships, ownership stakes. Few artists reach that tier. Sustaining it requires discipline and insulation from volatility. This case highlights the tension between street, authenticity, and corporate success. When public identity remains intertwined with territorial conflict and coded affiliation, federal agencies do not treat it as performance alone. They evaluate whether branding reflects operational reality. Lyrics, visuals, and associations become contextual evidence rather than marketing. That is the risk of straddling two worlds simultaneously. Mainstream recognition does not shield individuals from enterprise statutes. Platinum albums do not override federal guidelines. In environments where reputation is currency, attempts to preserve credibility can collide with legal boundaries. The streets operate under their own rules. Federal courts operate under another. When those systems intersect, the consequences are rarely symbolic. If the projections about indictments materialize, the timeline will shift from speculation to procedure. Arrests, arraignments, bond hearings, evidentiary disclosures. What once played out through music releases and social media narratives would transition into courtroom, transcripts, and sentencing memoranda. And in that transition, careers do not pause. They fade. It often unfolds this way. The moment someone reaches the highest level of success is the same moment the margin for error disappears. When there is the most to lose, the consequences become the most severe. Right now, Lil Baby is staring at the possibility of decades inside a federal penitentiary. If prosecutors move forward aggressively, the outcome could reshape not only his career, but the trajectory of his family's life. Business ventures stall. Contracts dissolve. Momentum vanishes. And all of it traces back to a confrontation that escalated inside a nightclub during a weekend that was supposed to represent celebration. From a distance, it appears irrational. A dispute at a strip club. A clash of ego between a chart-topping rapper and a professional athlete. But federal cases are rarely about one argument. They are about patterns, leverage, and cumulative exposure. What might have once been dismissed as nightlife chaos now sits within a legal framework that does not operate on emotion. It operates on statute, precedent, and sentencing guidelines. There are only two paths ahead. Either the evidence fails to meet the threshold prosecutors require, or it does not. If it does, the courtroom becomes the arena. Trials move methodically. Plea negotiations unfold quietly. And outcomes carry permanence. The music industry will continue evolving regardless. The legal system will not pause for celebrity. Whether Lil Baby ultimately defeats these allegations, or becomes another example of federal prosecution at scale, will depend on what can be proven beyond speculation. But what cannot be ignored is how quickly elevation can turn into exposure. The transition from global stages to federal courtrooms can happen faster than anyone anticipates. Cloud Chase will continue monitoring this situation as it develops, focusing not on rumor, but on verified movement within the courts and agencies involved. Because if indictments are filed, if charges are expanded, or if negotiations begin, those steps will define what happens next. If this does become one of the most significant legal collapses in recent hip-hop history, it will not be remembered for headlines alone. It will be remembered as a case study in how proximity to conflict, even at the height of success, can alter everything. The streets do not grant immunity for fame. Federal statutes do not recognize platinum records. And once the process begins, it moves forward with or without the spotlight.